before. And the colonies understood it, and there was a wave of independence struggle immediately after the war. That's when India becomes independent. That's when the Chinese, who were technically independent before, but not really, become really independent. Many parts of Africa had the big independence movements in those years and in the subsequent decades. And so when they broke away, when they became independent, these third world countries began to try, some with more success, some with less, to develop something other than agriculture, mining, and the usual things. Okay? The countries that typically went the furthest in developing their own industry were the communist countries. In other words, whether it be Eastern Europe, which if you know the history again, Eastern Europe becomes communist at the end of World War II as part of the whole results, if you like, of World War II, of the war between Germany and Russia, which Russia wins and finally invades Germany, and then basically instead of withdrawing back to the borders of Russia, technically did that, but made friendly countries in that cordon from the Baltic, the republics in the north, all the way down to Romania and Yugoslavia in the south. These countries were quickly industrialized. The Soviet program for these societies was not that they remain agricultural, but that they developed in the industry. And they developed a whole apparatus for that. Some, but again, the experience among them is also very varied. Some went very far. For example, Eastern Germany, spectacular industrialization in a short amount of time. Whereas places like Albania, almost none. So, yeah, and then everything in between that. So they too had their variations, but they did a bit more of that. And likewise, when there were communist revolutions in places like Vietnam or Cuba, they too tried at least, and they made some progress in developing their own independent industrial basis. Okay. These efforts were modest until the 1970s. In the 1970s, some cases a little earlier, they began to take off. That is, there began to be a serious, intensive industrialization all across the third world. Again, some more, some less, but a dramatic takeoff. And industry really begins to go in these parts of the world. By far the most dramatic is the Chinese. Nobody holds a candle to what they did. But some of the other countries, particularly big ones, that had enough of an internal diversity and enough size and enough productive capacity that they could kind of pull it off. The bigger ones were the most dramatic. India, China, Brazil, big ones, were able to take off and become significant industrial producers of almost everything. But every part of the world participated. And one of the things that drove them was what we've been talking about, but we've been looking at it from the point of view of the United States. And what was it? First, it was, to go back, remind you of things we've done, there was the 1970s as that peculiar period when the United States' special post-war position came to an end. We had been the top dog. Remember, we had been the one who comes out of World War II, no war on our soil, no bombs fell in the United States. Not only was our industrial capacity intact, but actually the war put people back to work, helped build industry. Remember, the unemployment of the Depression had been soaked up by the war, the war effort. People were back to work, the factories were humming, production was going real well, whereas the rest of the world was completely wiped out. Particularly the leading capitalist countries, Japan, Germany, Britain. They had been the scenes of horrible destruction. They had lost huge numbers of their most productive young men and women in the war and so forth. So the United States came out of the war with this sort of special position, top dog, the money of that became the money of the world, and the only place to go if you wanted to produce or to buy the equipment to rebuild your country from the devastation of the war. So from roughly 45 to the middle 70s, the the United States kind of has no competitor and enjoys the benefits that come from that situation. A part of the anger against the Soviet Union was we were the top dog except for this annoyance over here, which worried and upset us, although for different reasons. It wasn't an economic competitor, but it was a political danger. In the 1970s, this all changes. The Germans, the Japanese, the Europeans catch up. And they caught up, if you remember what I told you, in a very careful way. It's not just that they rebuilt their economies, but they rebuilt their economies with the simple understanding that given the United States' absolute dominance across the board, the only way they could hope to find a place for themselves in a new capitalist world economy is if they outdid the United States. Otherwise, they had no chance. They had to figure out how to produce the goods that Americans had taught the world to want and to buy, but to produce them either more cheaply or of better quality, or better yet, both. And they all went to work to try to do that. In some cases, it really was a quality focus. Make a better car, make a better TV, make a better camera, or whatever it was. And there the leadership was taken by our old competitors, because they had the high-tech capability, the Germans, the Japanese, and so forth. But for many, many corporations, they had to use a different tack. They weren't going to best the United States technologically, but they were going to best the United States by finding cheaper labor than Americans. And so began a rush of European firms and Japanese firms to find places where they could produce more cheaply than the United States and outcompete the United States, not technologically, but by being able to charge less for goods because you paid less to your workers, a lot less. Now, from the point of view of the third world, this is a kind of intriguing moment. Capital begins to move in large quantities to establish production facilities in the third world. Not to grow more crops and food and raw materials, not to mine more tin or silver or whatever it is, but to set up production. To find local people, train them in factory work, technological work. Suddenly you need to develop in the third world the supports for this. Schools, curriculum, road systems, transport mechanisms, communication systems to support an industrial development. And so you had in the 70s and 80s, 90s, right through the present, a kind of long-delayed third world beginning to catch up. And you begin in the third world to see, if you're not an economist, you don't follow this, but you see the outward signs. Cities develop that look a lot like Western cities. Tall skyscrapers, subway systems, television arrangements. The whole apparatus begins to reproduce itself in third world capitals. And what this does to the third world is create a kind of excitement. We're entering the modern economic system. We're joining the modern developed world. Our backwardness, our primitiveness, our marginality to what seems to be the center of world development is being overcome. And there was a lot of excitement, a lot of hope, a lot of positivity. Very interesting time, the 70s and the 80s. All different kinds of governments who got caught up in this. And it happened in the sense that much production was moved out of the advanced world, America, Europe, Japan, and into the various places that were the best positioned to pick up on this. And what do I mean by best position? Well, it depends. If you had certain kinds of qualities, you won out in this process. For example, if you spoke the same language as the colonial society, you were in good shape. India was in good shape. China was not. Nobody speaks Chinese except the Chinese. But everybody speaks English, like the Indians, the educated Indians do. So the educated Indian could immediately connect into the world that speaks English, the economics world, because so for example, the Indians became the place to go to if you wanted to establish